It's a nightmare trying to find a good gaming monitor, and I wish that was just me exaggerating. There are a million different specs to consider, price doesn't always align with quality, and in many cases, manufacturers just straight up lie on the spec sheet, or at the very least use super misleading branding. What's up everyone, this is Jake with Digital Trends, and I'm here to help guide you through the murky waters of buying a new gaming monitor. There's a lot to consider, so I'm going to give you a rundown of all the areas to focus on, from the most basic specs to things you can't pick up on from a product listing. Even if you know the basics, stick around because there might be a few areas that you haven't paid attention to that deserve just a little more focus. Before getting into it, we just passed 1 million subscribers, which is amazing, so keep that train rolling by getting subscribed. Also, leave me a thumbs up on this video if you enjoy it. I'm fairly new to the channel here, so a like helps me know that you want to see more videos about gaming monitors in the future. Alright, starting off with resolution, screen size, and aspect ratio. I'm grouping them all together here because they're the first things you should really focus in on when you're shopping. The screen size is the diagonal distance, corner to corner, of the monitor. I know this is basic stuff, but you'd be surprised how many people expect the size to be edge to edge. It's not, it's the diagonal. For most monitors, you're looking at a range of 24 to 32 inches, and the size of your monitor is really important to consider in the context of your resolution. On gaming monitors, the three most common resolutions you'll find are 1080p or Full HD, 1440p, which is sometimes referred to as QHD or 2K, and 4K, which you'll also find as UHD from time to time. Naturally, the higher the resolution, the more pixels on screen, the sharper it looks. That's easy, but that ignores that pixels need to be a physical size once they're actually on the screen. If you look at a 24-inch 1080p monitor and a 32-inch 1080p monitor, both have the same number of pixels. On the 32-inch monitor though, the physical size of the pixels needs to be larger because the screen itself is larger. Both monitors have the same resolution, but the 32-inch one will look less sharp because each individual pixel is more visible. This is pixel density, basically the idea that the more pixels you have in a smaller space, the more dense they are. You can find pixel density calculators online, and if you use one, aim for about 100 or so pixels per inch, but you don't need to do that. As a rule of thumb, you want a 24-inch screen for 1080p, a 27-inch screen for 1440p, and a 32-inch screen for 4K. Naturally, a higher resolution on a smaller monitor means higher pixel density, but the more important thing is to not buy a larger monitor with a lower resolution. Alright, and finally, aspect ratio. The most common aspect ratio is 16:9, and that's what you'll find on TVs and the vast majority of monitors available today. Ultra-wide 21:9 monitors are fairly common as well though. This is the same format you see in movies, pushing out the sides a bit to provide a wider field of view. Monitors like the Alienware 34QD OLED come with a 21:9 aspect ratio. 21:9 is great for immersive gaming and watching movies, but it doesn't always work. Some games will only render at the typical 16:9 aspect ratio, and if you're watching a YouTube video or some other piece of similar content, you'll see black bars on the side. Super ultra-wide 32:9 monitors extend this concept further by essentially placing two 16:9 monitors side by side. There are only a few of these available today, and they are far less supported than 21:9 monitors, so only consider them if you really need the extra screen real estate. Next up is the refresh rate, which is how many times the monitor refreshes the image on screen in a second. Most monitors have a refresh rate of 60 Hz. That means there are 60 new images displayed each second. Gamers want something higher. I typically recommend 144 Hz as a baseline, or somewhere around there. Some monitors are a bit higher at 165 Hz, while others are closer to 120 Hz, but they all provide really similar experiences. Higher refresh rates make your games look smoother. If you think about your frame rate, say your graphics card is producing 120 frames every second. If your monitor has a refresh rate of 60 Hz, you'll only see every other frame. Your GPU has 120 frames coming out, but your monitor can only show 60 of those. A higher refresh rate means you'll see more frames, leading to a smoother experience. It helps with your response time too. Higher refresh rates mean you see a new image more often each second. At 60 Hz, for example, you're seeing a new image about every 16.6 milliseconds, while a 120 Hz screen brings that down to 8.4 milliseconds. That extra time can make a pretty big difference in competitive games, which is why you see esports professionals generally go for a 240 Hz or even a 360 Hz monitor. Now, don't confuse your response time with the response time of the monitor. Those are different things. Response time on a monitor is how quickly a pixel can change from one color to another, and for gaming, lower response times are better. Higher response time makes the monitor feel like it's dragging a little bit, and you'll sometimes see smearing across the screen. Most gaming monitors advertise a response time of 1 millisecond or less, which makes shopping pretty tricky. The reason being is that response time can be very different depending on how you test it, so this is a huge reason why independent monitor reviews are so important. Rather than response time, the better indicator of how fast the monitor is the panel type it's using. The main panels you'll see are IPS, VA, and TN, and recently we've seen a lot of OLED panels as well. IPS panels are the bread and butter of the monitor world. They don't have great contrast, but they offer really solid color accuracy, great viewing angles, and pretty low response times. VA panels make some trade-offs. They have better contrast and they can produce more colors than IPS, but they don't always come with the best color accuracy out of the box. VA panels don't have super low response times either, so most monitor brands will use some sort of an overdrive feature to improve the response time. This can have an inverse effect of ghosting though, where you'll see a small black trail behind objects at higher overdrive levels. TN panels are mostly being phased out, and for good reason. They have really good response time, but the colors aren't great and they have horrible viewing angles. Like viewing the monitor from the side in some cases can show like completely inverse colors. The main reason you still see TN around is because these panels are cheap. Keep an eye out on budget gaming monitors. TN panels work just fine for gaming, but ideally you'll go with an IPS or VA panel if you can. And finally, OLED. OLED has great contrast, fantastic response time, and really solid color accuracy. And the main reason why is that each pixel in an OLED emits its own light, allowing for response times below 1 millisecond. They can also fully turn off, theoretically offering an infinite contrast ratio. OLEDs are expensive and hard to come by in gaming monitors right now, but they are really the cream of the crop of image quality. The panel type is linked to image quality, and there are three main specs you need to focus on when it comes to image quality: color coverage, brightness, and contrast. Brightness and contrast are easy enough. Brightness is measured in nits, and most IPS monitors hover around 300 to 400 nits of peak brightness. Monitors usually advertise peak brightness rather than typical brightness, so it's just a small area of the screen. The overall brightness is lower. A bright monitor is important for things like high dynamic range or HDR, but the brightness only really matters for the contrast. Contrast is a ratio of the brightest part of the monitor to the darkest part of the monitor at the same time on the screen. IPS panels will usually have a contrast ratio of 1,000 to 1, while VA panels typically have a contrast ratio of 3,000 to 1. The higher the contrast, the better in most cases. That said, a typical 1,000:1 contrast ratio is more than enough if you don't care about HDR or if you play a lot of competitive games. A lot of monitors even include settings to reduce contrast in competitive games, which can help with visibility. And finally, color coverage. There are various color spaces, but most monitors are aiming for 100% coverage of the sRGB spectrum. This is your typical color space you'll find on the vast majority of screens, comprising 16.7 million colors. Some monitors aim for coverage in wider color gamuts like Adobe RGB and DCI-P3. In the case of, say, Adobe RGB, it actually has 16.7 million colors, just like sRGB does, but it displays those colors more accurately, so you'll generally see lower coverage for Adobe RGB than you'll find for sRGB. sRGB is really the baseline, and the other ones are just the icing on top. Wider color spaces mostly matter if you want to do color work on your monitor, like photo or video editing. It doesn't matter too much if you're just gaming. However, wider color coverage generally indicates better color accuracy overall, so it's best to aim high if you can. Again, this is an area that's very important to confirm with independent reviews. Reason being is that some monitor brands just lie, or at the very least provide very misleading specs when it comes to brightness, contrast, and color coverage. For example, the Samsung Odyssey Neo G8, check out my review of that monitor in the card, advertises a peak brightness of 2,000 nits. That's kind of true, but only for a very small portion of the screen for a very brief period of time. Monitor reviews can bring these misleading specs down to earth, so make sure to check up on a monitor you're interested in before pulling the trigger. Another very important area is HDR, if that's important to you in the first place. HDR is a sore point on most monitors, but that's starting to change. HDR is catching up. In general, it's best to look for a display HDR certification on a monitor you're interested in. This is an industry standard certification that's been verified by a third party. There are multiple tiers, but Display HDR 600 is kind of the true entry point for HDR, rather than the much more common Display HDR 400 certification. I'd skip past Display HDR 400 if you really care about HDR. Be very careful with this though. Multiple brands, including Samsung, have their own Display HDR knockoffs that look and sound a lot like Display HDR without actually certifying anything. Make sure it is VESA's Display HDR certification if that's important to you. Most monitors aren't great with HDR, which calls for a lot of brightness and contrast. To get around this, you'll see IPS and VA panels use local dimming to improve contrast. Basically, local dimming spreads independent zones around the screen that can be brighter or darker, improving the contrast across the screen overall. The more zones, the better for HDR. Cheaper monitors generally use edge-lit dimming zones, which position the lights on the edge of the display. For the best HDR, you want full array local dimming, which positions the dimming zones all around the screen. This gets closer to OLED, which provides some of the best HDR you can get right now. OLEDs actually allow each pixel to dim itself individually, essentially providing a zone over every pixel. Alright, and finally price. There's a wide range of prices, but I want to provide a few numbers so you know what you might be spending depending on what display you're interested in. For a typical 1080p monitor, expect to spend around $200. You're not going to have great HDR, the image quality may not be the best you've ever seen, but you'll still get a decent resolution, a high refresh rate that's great for the vast majority of people. If you want to step up to a 1440p monitor, you're going to spend closer to $400 to $500. $400 is really the baseline for the upgraded 1080p version, but if you want really nice HDR or extra features, you can spend upwards of $600 or $700. 4K monitors pick up there. The cheapest ones are around $700 to $800 that just provide really high resolution and a really high refresh rate. If you want fantastic HDR, great image quality, or maybe a 21:9 aspect ratio, you're gonna spend closer to $1,000 and sometimes even closer to $1,500. The sky's kind of the limit when it comes to 4K. In general though, around $200 to $300 for 1080p, $400 to $500 for 1440p, and anywhere from $700 to $1,000 for 4K is what you can expect to spend. That's a lot to go through, but gaming monitors aren't simple beasts. If you have any lingering questions about gaming monitors and which one you should buy, make sure to leave me a comment below. While you're down there, make sure to get subscribed and leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it. Alright everyone, thanks for watching and I will see you in the next video.